All right, we'll probably get a, hopefully. Yep, all right, so we are recording. Thanks everybody for joining us again tonight. So just two quick notes. First, tomorrow I will be here at Fire Station 6. If you're not super familiar with where that is in the city, it is, hey, I have to take Google Maps to get Google Maps. It's right at the airport, so it's on 25th Street. And you can find it, it's Googleable, Salem Fire Station 6, and the address is 2470 25th Street Southeast. I'm gonna paste this in the chat as well. So I will be here tomorrow. And when you come in, let me see if I change this. So as you turn into this parking lot, there is a door at this corner, kind of in the corner between the station and the other building. I will be in this doorway. So if you come up, that's about where I'll be. Hopefully everybody can kind of see that and you know where I am. If you are concerned or you get here and I'm not standing outside because it's cold, I might be right inside the door. I'll probably pop out and wave if you come up to the door, and then we can get you your background check and do your photo if that's when that happens. So thank you for everybody that's called and coordinated with me. Jay, I did see your email earlier. If tomorrow morning works for you, that's probably best. That's good. Thanks for the thumbs up. I appreciate that. And so the one other thing, I know it came up last week. Terry told me that in the CERT book, and everybody's very right, that in the CERT book and the CERT program, it says do not self-activate, right? That's very true for 99.999% of things. The caveat, there is one time that I authorize you to self-deploy, and if it's a catastrophic earthquake and I can't call you to tell you to deploy, please take care of your family, take care of your neighbors, and then put on your vest and start doing good things for the community. That's really the way we kind of look at it, almost like it's a target. So start in your home, work with your neighbors and the people around you, and then start to span out and help the rest of the community. And by going to meet your your CERT team members and the other people around. And if you are not in a safe space, if you are not okay walking away from your home and the people you care about, please don't. The duty of the CERT, as much as we appreciate you volunteering and doing it, if you cannot comfortably and safely leave people at home while you go do those CERT duties, stay at home and take care of those people. Your family, your friends are important to you and to us, and it's important that you have a good, healthy, healthy mindset as you're going to respond and help out with these people. So everything else, wait until I call you or email you and ask you to help out. Otherwise, if it's a catastrophic disaster and there is no way of me getting a hold of you, i.e. all of the phone lines are down, nobody has internet or power, you have my authorization to start helping with yourself, your family, and then get out into the community and put your CERT vest on and help out. And I very much appreciate everybody who does that, but do it safely, right? Safety, safety, safety. So those are really kind of the two big things for me. Does anybody have any questions that have come up in the last several days that you've thought about? Had some crazy, oh my goodness, what am I going to do in the events of this? Any big questions? Volume seems low. Am I quiet? Am I too quiet?
No,
for
not
everybody?
at all.
No,
Nope.
I can hear you perfectly loud. I just can't see. Do you have anything on your screen at all?
It does say I am screen sharing, so you might see the fire station map on the screen. Let me.
Yeah, that's what I see.
Okay. All right.
Everything is black.
If you're on an iPad, I know sometimes if you're on an iPad, you have to actually select through the list of things to view and actually select to view the screen that's being shared. We've run into that a few times. I don't know if you're on an iPad, but I know some of the Apple devices, you actually have to go in, click on the video icon or the people icon and select either people talking, all people, or the actual screen share that's up. So
Yeah, I'm on a HP. It's a brand new laptop. Yeah.
Okay. Interesting. I don't know why it wouldn't be screen sharing.
Yeah, I can't see you or your screen.
Interesting.
Might be seeing someone else. Do you see a name or anything on the screen?
Yeah, it pops up with your name when you talk.
Okay, interesting, because hopefully it would pop up with mine. And my mug, sorry folks. But if it's not, I'm not sure what's going on with your computer. All
Do
right.
you have your camera actually turned on?
Yes, can I
No,
look
I
at,
was talking about the other girl, because
Danielle, can you turn your camera on for 2 seconds to see if that works?
Man, I can, just don't hate on me. Okay. Hold on. Yeah, it's not letting me start video.
so she might not have her video settings set. If it's a brand new laptop, you may not have set it. For the million times that I've used this, that's what happened to me, is I couldn't see anybody and I couldn't see myself, but I didn't have the camera options and stuff set up. So
Gotcha.
that
Can you
may
see
be your
me?
issue.
Okay, we see you, Danielle.
Okay.
Do you see Greg now?
No.
All right.
Hey, we see you.
Well, okay. You might have to go into your settings and turn on video, or because I'm looking, I don't see anything that's. I don't see anything specifically on ours that I can do to show my screen besides it already being on. Excuse me. All right. So one of the other things that I am going to send to Lola to share with everybody, or share the next class, and actually I'll probably send it out to the entire CERT team, is for the last several, really kind of month and a half, I have been doing presentations with the city in reference to being prepared. So I spent an hour talking to city employees about how to make your plan, your big set plan for disasters. And I spent an hour talking about doing home hazard hunt and looking at how kind of that from the 0 earthquake event to 72 plus hours, how do we start, how do I process it, and how do I take care of things? And then today was the last session, the first of 4 last sessions with the city that I will be able to share when I get the video link. But it's really what my 2 weeks ready looks like, and kind of some of that more detailed stuff. So with that, that's just some additional stuff. If you choose to watch it and listen to me yammer on for another couple hours, you're welcome to, but you don't have to. It's just, it sometimes helps hearing and seeing how people have actually gotten 2 weeks ready and how they've built out kits, just as a understanding of it, and some of that. Anyways, I am going to step out and let Terry and Lola take over and do a phenomenal job as they always do. So thank you, everyone.
One quick question before you disappear.
Please.
You were mentioning the background tomorrow.
Mhm.
What times are you going to be there?
I will be here from 08, so 8 a.m. until noon.
Okay. And
Does that work?
then do
Does
we
that
need
work
to
for you?
bring anything specific with us?
So what I will ask for when you get here is I will ask for your first, middle, and last names, and I will ask for your social, your date of birth, and your address. And
Okay.
that's pretty much all that goes into it. So if you need to refresh any of those numbers or your address, I don't generally check people's driver's license, because generally if you know the social well enough to recite it off the top of your head, you're hopefully the right person. And then if the background comes back as hits for a certain reason, i.e. identity fraud, we might have another conversation coming up, but hasn't happened yet. And hopefully that'll help everybody. But I will be here at Station 6. The address again is in the chat, and I hope you all have a good night.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Say again. You're going to be gone for the evening. Yeah. Okay. I'll hang tight for a little bit. All right. But probably close to 6:45. Okay. Self position here. All right. I can see some of you, and some of you are just names. Good evening. So we're going to talk about
the second chapter of the medical. Hopefully you've all had a chance to read that. I realize these classes during the week are kind of close together, but nonetheless, let me pause for a minute while I catch up this thing up to speed here. Let's see. Broken bones, bleeding, people not breathing. Very cheery stuff to be. So there's the summary. Okay, so before I jump into that, as we've mentioned before, Lola and I did a couple of videos where we take a look at the inside of our CERT kit and what we're carrying around inside, and what you have at home. You know, my CERT kit per se consists of so many bags full of different tools and equipment that I couldn't possibly carry it myself. It's a good thing I have a 3/4 ton van. So, but there's a few little things I wanted to show you that are things to consider having in there. And I've got a few samples that are just off the camera that I'll show. And unfortunately, with the one person who, if you still can't see us, I will try to describe these things as well. But there are certain things that are very useful. Probably one of the most important ones is a flashlight. So LED flashlights are very available today. The technology has come a long way. They work very well to the extent that the old incandescent bulb flashlights are really going away. Even the really high quality ones like a mag light, you can still buy them, I think, but unfortunately they eat the batteries and they don't put out near as much light as these LED, as a little, very small LED flashlight. So this particular one, you can see compared to my hand, is a nice, very bright flashlight. It's a high quality one, aluminum. These are probably somewhere in the ish $25 range for one of these. They have a nice lens. You can adjust the beam from a flood to a spot. They have this one. One of the things I like about it is that it has, you can see it on the camera very well, but it has a belt clip attached to it right here. So you can just clip this on your belt, or you can stick it in your pocket or your CERT bag or whatever it is you're carrying. They also make flashlights that have the light bar on the side of them as opposed to on the end. The nice thing about these is that they can throw out quite a bit of light. If you mount them in such a way that the light is shining up, one of these will generally light an entire room. Not as brightly as it would be with your electricity on, but well enough that you can function in a room like that. And this one does have a magnet on it. I got some paper clips here that are quite well stuck to this now. So that's a useful addition that they have. There's other flashlights out there. This one is the sort of thing that you can buy from Harbor Freight Tools or any number of other places. This is about a $2 flashlight. It is true, you're going to get what you pay for. One of the things about these that I will recommend, whether you're buying a flashlight or if you decide that you're going to get some of those FRS two-way radios, make sure that the product that you buy utilizes a common, easily obtainable battery. This particular flashlight is $2 flashlight. You unscrew the end cap. In the center is a cartridge that holds 3 AAA batteries. Okay, you can find AAA batteries most anywhere. And if you have other devices such as like my personal FRS radios, which are Midland, also use AAA batteries. So now there's a commonality. You don't have to have a variety of batteries. This nice belt clip aluminum flashlight here that is a lot more expensive than this $2 flashlight. It also holds a little cartridge that holds 3 AAA batteries. The cartridges themselves are probably not interchangeable, but the batteries are. So that might be something to consider. when you're getting it. But I do recommend you get yourself a good LED flashlight because they'll last a lot longer and they put out an awful lot of light. Extremely useful thing to have in your kit and around your house. I also usually will recommend you have some sort of utility knife. This one happens to be a folding lockback blade. It also has a belt clip. It locks open. I much prefer lockback blades in the knife rather than one like the old school pocket knife where there's nothing to lock the blade open. And you can easily have that fold back and cut the back of your fingers. But some kind of knife like that is a fairly useful tool to have as well. You don't have to spend a lot of money on them. This one happens to be an expensive knife, but there's no reason. You don't have to spend a ton of money on them. It's useful to have a knife. That will not take the place of a pair of scissors. Throw a pair of scissors into your kit. I strongly recommend that because let me tell you, it's a lot easier to cut stuff with scissors than it is with a knife. And then another thing, and this is something that Lola has in her kit, I also have it in mine, and that is, this is a multi-tool. So it has a pair of pliers, it has a knife blade in it that does lock open, and this one happens to also have, it has wire cutters right here in the joint. This is a very minimalist multi-tool because this is the one that I used to carry at work, and it also has a belt clip on it as opposed to the ones that come with a holster. Nothing wrong with those holstered ones. You can get these multi-tools in a variety of styles and prices that are a lot like a Swiss Army knife, and they will have quite a large number of options if that's the one you decide to go with. You can pick something that fits your style, but this is a fairly handy tool to have as well. So I just kind of wanted to talk about that a little bit. The other thing I was going to mention is, and I believe I talked about this, when you're building your CERT kit, if you choose to do that, the green CERT labeled backpack or duffel bag is great, but if you've got something else that you can utilize, something you already have, there's nothing wrong with substituting that. The backpack is just a way to carry your goods. It's nice that it says CERT, but it doesn't have to. We're not going to sweat that. So you can improvise with something else. The same thing goes true for other gear. This usually makes people laugh when they see it. This is one of my CERT helmets. It is labeled CERT on the side. It has a CERT label on the back, the national logo. It has this yellow piece that says CERT here. And then I have the reflective letters on the front that say CERT, and it's the appropriate shade of green. And yes, it looks like the helmet that Sergeant Schultz wore in Hogan's Heroes. This happens to be made out of aluminum. And this actually is a Swiss firefighter's helmet. When I got this, it was bright yellow. And I sanded it down and I painted it the appropriate shade of green. And you know what? It makes a decent CERT helmet. You can improvise. If you have an ANSI rated hard hat in some other color other than green, you don't need to go out and buy another one. Scuff it up with some sort of a Scotch-Brite pad and paint it green. That works. You can buy the CERT decals, put it on there. So, we're not asking you to go out and spend all of your life savings on all of this gear. It just needs to protect your noggin, and we want it to be green so that it identifies you as a CERT team member. You're wearing your hard hat, you're wearing the green vest, or in this case, as you can see tonight, I'm wearing a green CERT polo. It is labeled up here. It looks like you're wearing some semblance of a uniform. And the point behind that is that people, especially in a disaster, they see a group of people who are dressed more or less the same in something that looks like a quasi-uniform. They're going to assume that you probably know what's going on and you have all the answers. That's probably a good reason for you to say, I don't want to wear that stuff. But it is a magnet. People will come towards you, and typically they're going to say, can you give me any information? And there are also a lot of them are going to say, what can I do to help? So that's really good. So improvise your gear as necessary. Don't necessarily go out and spend tons and tons of money. If you want to, by all means, go ahead, get the best equipment that you can buy. We appreciate that. But it's important you have the vest, the hard hat, the protective gear, the goggles, the gloves, various types of gloves, that sort of thing. Knee pads are an awful nice thing to have in your kit. A on that way. Some medical masks is not a bad idea. These days, a lot of people are carrying those around with them anyway. So, go ahead and look at those videos and see the different things that we've got in the kits, and it may help you out deciding what you want to do on yours. Yes, Lola.
Terry, I just want to let you know that I now have the link for your kit as well. So tonight, after the class, I will send out all of the links for the kits again, so everyone can read them or see them together.
Okay, good. Okay, so last week, we talked about the first part of medical, the life-saving measures that when you first come across a victim, the controlling the bleeding, breathing, checking to see if they're going into shock, the various different ways to treat that, maintaining body temperature, that sort of thing. The physical treatments that we can give, and also some of the emotional patients that need to be dealt with. There is a section in this class, we will talk about the disaster psychology. And I think when we get to that section, I'll talk more about that, but we're discovering this year that and I wouldn't necessarily compare what's happened this year so far to a disaster such as an earthquake, but unless you lived up the canyon and your house burned to the ground, it's going to seem like a huge disaster to you personally. But we're seeing around the country a lot of people not really having the skill set to handle the stress. And we'll talk more about that when we get into the disaster psychology. That's a whole separate section in and of itself. So we talked about the critical life-saving measures, and then there's other injuries that we might have to treat: burns, a variety of wounds, fractures or dislocations or sprains or strains, and we can't necessarily tell the difference. Cold-related injuries, heat-related injuries, and the section is in there on insect bites and stings, and except for people who are actually dangerously allergic to those sorts of things, that's not necessarily something that we're probably going to be dealing with, unless a CERT team member himself gets a bite or a sting. So that's just kind of a quick review, a summary of what we talked about last class. So we move on to Disaster Medical 2, Unit 4. And this has got some pretty good stuff on here. The operative phrase here is a mass casualty incident. That's what this is going to be. There's going to be so many people who are injured to some degree or another that all of the professional responders are going to be overwhelmed, and they're not going to be able to get where they need to be in a timely manner. We wish they could, but the reality is they're not going to be able to do that. And on top of that, all of the places that you might go for your help, the hospital, for example, they have to check and make sure that their building is safe to occupy before they can let people in. So that means they're going to have to move everybody out so that they can have somebody, an engineer, come in and assess the building and let them know, is this actually going to survive or not? Same thing with the bridges. They have to have an engineer examine the bridge and say, this is good to use, or no, it's not good to use. Last thing we need to have is a bunch of vehicles falling down into the river, particularly if they're fire trucks or police vehicles or such, trying to respond to somebody who needs help and the bridge isn't any good. So that's why they have to do these assessments. The 911 center has to be assessed to make sure that it is secure and is going to be serviceable for the people who are going to be there, although I don't know how much work they're going to be able to do if the power's off, the phone lines are down, all that sort of thing. However, currently at the 911 center, there is a two-way amateur or ham radio, which they can fire up to utilize. And there is a frequency set aside for us for CERT, where we have a way, as long as someone's manning it, we have a way to contact the city and let them know what we're doing, what we need, what we're seeing, what kind of damage there is, that sort of thing. So the city ultimately will rely to some degree on amateur radio. And so there's a lot of CERT people like myself who acquired a ham radio license to use for emergency purposes. There's a lot of other guys out there who that's their hobby. They have excellent gear. They're well trained and well experienced. But some of those people have also come and taken the CERT class just so that they know what we're about and they know what we do, so that we'll be able to work with them. That's a good thing. We'll talk a little bit about the functions of disaster medical operations, medical treatment areas, the head-to-toe assessment, which there should be a video link. I will describe it, but there should be a video link for a head-to-toe assessment that Lola and I did. And then public health considerations, which is your hygiene and sanitation. Keep in mind that anytime there's ever a big storm or a big earthquake or something, there's a couple of things that go along with that, and that's dysentery and cholera. So that's where your hygiene and sanitation really come into play. So let's kind of jump into this. I'll hit some of the high points here. We've got the overview. Mass casualty incidents, they have a few examples of that. Of course, the purposes of this class, we're talking about the earthquake. Anything smaller than that, generally speaking, the city of Salem's emergency responders are quite capable of taking care of pretty much anything that comes down their way. The fire department, they have all these reciprocal agreements with all the surrounding fire departments, so we can pull help in from the city of Dallas, Polk County, Woodburn, all around us. People will show up. Marion County Fire will show up, and they'll pull as many resources as they need. And generally speaking, you know, if a bus crashes, a busload of people, they can get, you know, they don't need us. That's a situation where we would have to be activated by the city. And generally speaking, they don't need us because we have some very good first responders. So for us as CERT members, the only time we're going to be worried about that is the earthquake, and you'll know when the earthquake happens. They do talk about building collapse here. Generally speaking, we don't have buildings collapse. They've all been pretty well built. However, downtown Salem has some very old buildings and they're unreinforced masonry. So that would be areas that there's probably going to be casualties there, but as CERT team members, trying to get inside of a portion of an unreinforced masonry building is probably something that we're not going to do. That would be the more dangerous areas, is where the trained professionals are going to be focusing on. There's going to be one of the tasks in a mass casualty incident is probably establishing a perimeter. That's something that as CERT members we can do to keep other people out so that they're not in the way and putting themselves in danger. Anytime you're going to do this, the size up and the setup, if we're going to search a house or an apartment building or something, we're going to have to do that lap around the outside of the building and make sure that it's safe. Identify the survivors. Do they need medical care? Can we give it to them where they are? Do we need to transport them somewhere else? You're going to need a lot of volunteers to do that. Transporting people on a backboard or a stretcher or something of that nature consumes a lot of manpower. You'll need a lot of people. Typically, depending upon the size of the victim, 6 to 8 people on the stretcher or the backboard. And then you're probably going to need, if you're having to take them a couple of miles to where there's a place that you can drop them off where there's a higher level of medical care, you might need 2 or 3 teams to get them that far. You're going to be constantly rotating people out as they get tired. And there is a section here about transporting, and hopefully we'll be able to show you that as well. So the CERT volunteers, and what is the very first thing they say? Call 911 and provide the operator with the information gathered. Well, on a day-to-day basis, if you happen to be first on an accident scene or some incident, by all means do that. As a CERT member, you're going to be phoning that information in. But in the earthquake, you're not going to be able to get a dial tone, let alone get a hold of anybody on the phone. So you would wear your CERT gear, and if you're going to be doing some work, have your personal protective gear, your goggles and your gloves and that sort of thing on, and some really good shoes. Then you're going to have to go in and start assessing the situation, and you're going to be controlling bleeding, making sure that they're breathing, and treating people for shock if that's indicated. So at some point, you're going to have to take all of this documentation that you're doing all along, and realistically, you're not going to be holding one hand on somebody's bleeding limb and with the other hand writing notes down on a sheet of paper. That's not what I mean to imply. But at the first reasonable opportunity, before what happened fades out of your memory, you want to write down the details of what you did and where you were. And then, they can be messy notes. It doesn't matter, shove in your pocket, whatever. And then at some point, you can sit down where it's calm and quiet, and you've got actually a place to write, and you can transcribe those notes into something that's a bit more along the lines. If you've got a sample of the documentation, and so that's the one that you keep and turn into the city at the end. So they've got all of this spelled out here. I don't want to go through every single line here. This one is the section 3, functions of disaster medical operations in your Unit 4 book, which they have a page number down here. Yes, they do. Page 4-4 shows you a flow chart of the medical operations, and this just kind of mimics what CERT team members do. This one happens to be just more specific. So you've got somebody in charge of medical. Ideally, that's somebody that has some professional medical experience. When we've done exercises in the past, we've been fortunate enough to have a charge nurse who was taking the class, and boy, did they have that well organized for us. You've got people doing triage, you got people doing transport, you have people doing treatment. You're going to have people doing your head to toe assessments, that sort of thing. If it becomes necessary to set up a morgue, there's a whole separate set of rules that apply to that you have to staff it all the time. Which the only time I think in CERT that we would consider doing that is if we had a patient that we had moved into our treatment center, and then at some time they succumb to their injuries, then you would have to set up a morgue and keep them protected. And the book will go into some detail on that. If you run across somebody, you're searching a house in your neighborhood and you find somebody who's passed from their injuries from the earthquake or what have you, that person, you're going to leave them where they are. Number one, it utilizes our resources in a way that isn't really productive. It sounds cold, but it's true. And the other thing is, it's much easier for the professionals when the time comes when they start doing this sort of thing, that they can identify that person if they're in a house or in an office building. Because generally speaking, there's a reason why that person was there. If it's a home, chances are they live there. So that's going to make it a little easier for them to identify this person. So we try not to move them if we can avoid it. Your medical treatment center, you can have decentralized or centralized. Decentralized, you may have several small treatment areas around where you can treat people on site outside of the building that you're treating them in, such as you saw in the video, the CERT in action. And they set up a little treatment center right outside of the community center. That would be a decentralized, because that's a very small one, and there may be other places where you might find other victims. They'll set one up there. A centralized treatment area is where you're going to be moving people to where hopefully you've got maybe medical reserve corps is there, or you've got somebody who's got medical treatment experience who is willing to direct the CERT team members in that manner and kind of take charge of that sort of thing. And then from that point, you're going to move them on to the professional medical care, wherever that might be and whoever that might be, whether that is doctors who are local here and nurses and they're setting up their own field hospital, or whether that be somebody from the National Guard who's setting up a field hospital, that sort of thing. So you're going to set up a treatment center in such a manner that you've got your different groups that you've triaged people. So you have your critical people in one area, the people who were delayed in a second area, and the minor or the walking wounded in the third area. And it's important to monitor them. You're going to be re-triaging these people periodically, the same as if you're in the hospital and they wake you up in the middle of the night and ask you if you're sleeping. Well, I was. But that's because they're triaging you. They're making sure that you're getting better, or at least at the very least, you want them I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought. Happened to catch the fact that somebody sent a message here, a little chat. So sorry about that. But anyway, you're going to be re-triaging people because you want to make sure they're not getting any worse. If they are, you're going to have to change your treatment options for that person and maybe move them up the ladder to get them to professional medical care. Somebody had asked the question, can you use a battery operated tape recorder to take notes as you do in triage your response? Absolutely. If you've got one with you and you've got batteries for it, you will want to transcribe that information onto paper, because that's what we're going to turn into the city. And that way you can erase the tape, and or if it's electronic, it doesn't actually use tape anymore. You can wipe that and record new notes. So, but by all means, yes, you can. So you also want to consider where you're putting your treatment center. Is it accessible to transportation? And depending upon the situation, which you have to assess at the time of the event. But that is probably going to mean if you're going to start amassing a group of people who are wounded and need transportation, you may want to consider trying to find a place that's not very far away, that is a large enough clear area where a helicopter can land, because that's probably going to be the most viable way to do transport in and out of here. You're not going to be able to drive very far. Even if you have some really burly four-wheel drive vehicle, you got to remember that the people in the back who are injured and wounded, as you're bouncing over all kinds of debris, that's a pretty rough ride. You know, if you've ever seen episodes of MASH and they show the Jeep with the stretchers on it, and they're driving usually pretty slow, and because it was a TV show, they had dirt roads that they were driving on. They weren't going cross country. We will be doing the equivalent of going across country. So that's something to consider. Light damage, you assess the survivors as they find them. Moderate damage, you assess the survivors as they find them. However, you're sent to medical treatment centers a safe distance from the incident. That's the thing, is it's a question that comes up quite a bit, is if you go into a building and you find somebody, do we move them or do we not? In the case of the CERT video, the CERT in action video, and they're inside that community center and it was a windstorm, the structure was probably relatively sound, and therefore it offers you shelter from the rain and the wind, and it's not a concern. If the building is generally speaking sound, then it's not a bad idea to keep them there, because you don't have to move them, and plus they're in shelter. But in the event of an earthquake, that may not be a viable option, and you may want to treat that person where they sit, but you have to ask yourself the question, is there any risk of this building coming down on top of this person if we don't move them? So you may have to make the choice to move them out. That's a big consideration, and you can never second guess in advance, is that what we're going to do or not, without seeing the building after it's been damaged by the earthquake. So once again, you're using your brain as the best tool that you have available to you, and utilize all your senses to assess what's the best answer at that particular time. And they do, even in here, you should never declare or attempt to move a patient who has died. If you find a deceased person, document the location, notify medical personnel. That's something we're going to document and pass on. Kind of what I was saying, they actually have it in the book. The next thing they jump into is a head to toe assessment. So this is different than your triage. And a head to toe assessment, you're not going to do this until you've seen everybody in the area, in that building or that wherever the people are, to make sure that you've treated all of the things that are going to kill somebody right now, unless you tend to that. If they're not breathing, that's going to kill them right now. If they're bleeding heavily, that's going to kill them. You've got to take care of those things. So that's a very fast thing that hopefully you will be able to do in about 30 seconds to maybe a minute. The professionals can do it between 15 and 30 seconds. They do this kind of stuff all the time, and they're a bit more experienced at it than we are. That's what triage is. It's the acronym for that is START, simple triage, and rapid treatment, to to take care of those things are going to kill your patient right away, or victim, however you want to look at that. A head-to-toe assessment is a much slower process that you go through when you have somebody in your treatment center and you have the time to focus on that one individual. So it is, the name is quite literally descriptive. You examine them starting at the head, work their way down to their feet. If you have multiple patients in a treatment center that you're going to be doing this with, you're going to stack, no, that's not the right word. Sorry. Yeah. Wrong visual image. You're going to lay your patients out on the ground or on the floor, whatever you've got, and hopefully you make them as comfortable as you can. But you're going to have one person, let's say, for example, you've got somebody laid out and their head is to the east, so their feet are to the west. The next person, the person next to them, their feet are going to be to the east and their head is to the west. And then you reverse that back and forth. So not only is a head-to-toe assessment the order in which you examine them, it's also the way you lay your patients out in your treatment center, literally head to toe next to each other, laid out next to each other. The reason for that is twofold. Number one, you start at somebody's head and you examine them all the way down to their feet. And when you're finished and you're going to start the next person, their head is right there. So you're not in a position of having to step over your patient, which is something you never want to do, because you're always at a risk of dropping something or tripping and falling on them. You never want to step over your patient. So this way you can just slalom your way around from the one person's feet to the next person's head and work your way down, and you're just weaving back and forth as you do this task. The other reason is that you don't want to have, with people laid out and you've got trauma and injuries of some sort or other, or shock, either one will tend to make people vomit. And so if you have people laid out in a treatment center, obviously you don't want them too closely together. But nonetheless, if one person becomes ill, it's going in the direction of somebody's feet, not the next person's face, which is generally considered not be very nice. Somebody else has got a statement here. If you have doctors or nurses in your area and they are home at the time of the incident, do they become the medical lead in an area? What about retired medical personnel? So that's actually two different situations. Professional firefighters, the police officers, other sorts of safety officers, and medical active, that is working, currently employed medical personnel. Generally speaking, there is a protocol that's already in place for those people. The event of an earthquake or some other big event, they have standing orders that tells them what it is you're supposed to do, where they report. Now there's always contingency plans. And yeah, if you had somebody who was medically trained and for some reason they're trapped in the neighborhood and they couldn't get out, by all means ask them. See if you can talk them into taking that lead position. That's going to be up to them. We certainly have no authority to order them to do that. Retired medical personnel, by all means, if you got somebody in your neighborhood, get them involved in the program, get them involved in CERT. That's really a good idea, because you're going to need that help. The same thing goes for veterinarians. In a disaster, they know a lot more about medical than we do. And generally speaking, the internal arrangement of organs, and we're not going to be doing surgery anyway, but the concept of people bleeding and not breathing and all that kind of stuff. I mean, they have to learn about human medicine in order to become a veterinarian. So that's a great resource. By all means, try and use it. If you have somebody in your neighborhood or somebody who comes up and says they're a doctor, we're not going to worry too much about checking their credentials at that point. So, okay, let me move on with this then. The head-to-toe assessment, this goes beyond the life-threatening injuries. You're trying to find out all the concealed injuries. Adrenaline will cover or hide a lot of things. People who are, who have a big load of adrenaline from all the things that are going on, they may not notice all of the injuries that they have. And then eventually, though, it'll start wearing off and they'll start all sorts of pain here and there. So you're going to have them laid out. It's nice if they're elevated. If you have some sort of something to use as an exam table, that would be great. But if you don't, you're going to have to do it on the floor. So you're going to want to be able to be somebody that can get down on their hands and knees. And looks like Greg is getting ready to sneak out. So,
Good luck. I'll see everybody who went tomorrow.
Okay.
If we're getting background checks,
Yes.
or I will see you on Thursday.
Okay. Have a good evening. Okay, so you're going to start at the head, and what you're looking for initially is obviously any kind of bleeding or any other fluids leaking out of the head, whether that be from the ears, the eyes, the nose, and that kind of stuff. So what you're going to see is probably one of two things, either blood or a clear fluid, which is really bad because that's going to be the fluid that surrounds your brain. Those sorts of things can be indicative of head trauma. Also, any sort of deformation to the skull. I'm talking about obvious deformation to the skull. I mean, everybody has a different shaped head, you know, and you're feeling around and doing all this kind of stuff. You're not trying to read the lumps on their head unless you're, you know, somebody who does that. Tell their fortune to them, but I don't know that it's going to matter too much. So anyway, you start off feeling around. They're laying on their back, so you're putting your hands in back of their head, feeling around, that kind of stuff. Of course, you're wearing your nitrile gloves to protect you. But when you reach around behind and then pull your hands out, check them. Check your gloves to make sure that there's nothing on them. You're not, because there might be bleeding in the back, but from the front you can't see it. So you want to take a look for that. Once you have done that, you're going to start looking at the obvious things in the face, around the eyes. You can take something, a pen or a pencil or anything like that, hold it up just like the cops do for the DUI exam, where you hold your head steady and follow the object with just their eyes. And you want to make sure that they can do that with both eyes. You're looking for what's called I hate it when that happens. People tend to be bilaterally symmetrical. So more or less, each side of the body is like the other side. So if they should be able to track with both eyes. If they can't, you want to ask them if they're conscious, is that normal for them? As you know, if you got somebody with a glass eye, they're not going to know unless you ask them. But ordinarily, most people, they can track with both eyes at the same time. You want to make sure that there's not a bruising around the eye from some sort of impact. And if they're conscious, you're going to ask them what happened to you. You're making this, you're filling out a chart while you're doing this, or your buddy is, because you got a buddy with you always when you're doing head to toe assessment. Never do one alone. You've got to have your buddy with you. A, you have a witness. B, you have somebody who is taking all the notes for you as you're calling it out. So you want to know what the mechanism of injury was if you can. So that's kind of obvious. You have them open their mouth, stick their tongue out, move it left to right. Basically, you're checking two things. A, can they follow simple commands? That's a mental status test. And B, can they actually do what you asked, which shows you motor control to make sure that that's all good. Also, you want to look behind the ears back here in the mastoid area. There can be bruising back here that is not from an impact to that specific area. There was a doctor in the Civil War. His name was Battle, oddly enough. And so they call that battle syndrome. It has nothing to do with the war. It has to do with the man's name who made the connection. But this bruising back in here can be indicative of some sort of skull injury. Doesn't necessarily mean there's anything we can do about it or we necessarily understand what that means, but you see something that's out of the norm, then you want to make a note of that, because once that person gets to a higher level of professional medical care, they've got these notes saying this is what we saw. And they're probably going to reassess them anyway. They better anyhow. They're going to reassess that patient anyway. But it helps them to know that at the time that we did this, and we're going to date stamp and time stamp that document, they can look at that and say, well, we see this person has battle syndrome. They can look at the chart and say, oh, this CERT team member noticed it too. So we know that they've had it for X number of hours. That's important information for them because they know a lot more about what their treatment's going to be because they know how long it's been since the injury, or at least a better idea. So as you work your way around the head and the jaw and everything, you're checking this, and of course you're touching them. And I should have started off by saying, of course, you identified yourself and you asked the person if you could do this, because you don't want to start touching them and doing all this kind of stuff without their permission, unless, of course, they're unconscious and then it's implied consent. But so you work your way down. The next part is the collarbone. There's all sorts of Latin names for all these bones that I don't know. I'll stick with the English. So you get your collarbone. You're checking to make sure that there's no irregularities. Usually, you can see a step in the alignment of the shoulders if something's broken. If they're conscious and you touch it, they're probably going to let you know rather loudly. So you're checking for that, checking the shoulders. Personally, I like to do the arms, both arms from that point, work your way down, check and make sure that the elbow joints, the wrist joints, everything moves. You're not hearing sounds. The official term for it is crepitus, but it sounds like you've got a bag of Rice Krispies and you're crunching it. And that's because you've got broken bones in there that are moving against each other, rather an unpleasant sound. So you're checking all of that, making all these notes. You would have your patient take a hold of like your fingers and have them squeeze, from both hands. You squeeze them, and you're again checking: can they follow the command? Can they perform the task? And can they perform it equally? If one side is really weak, the other side is strong. And at the same time, you can probably check and see, do they have is their hands with one hand cold versus the other one? Why is that? Is there a circulation problem? You're trying to figure out as much of this information as you can. From there, you work your way down the torso, down the center of the chest. You want to check the sternum and make sure it's not broken. The easiest way to do that is to take your hand like this, blade your hand, put that against their chest, take your other hand and push against it. If you're working on somebody of the opposite gender, this is a great way to do that. From there, you're going to move around to the sides of the rib cage. If somebody has broken ribs, again, or cracked ribs, they're going to be very sensitive and they're going to tell you about it right away if they're conscious. So you're trying to do that. There's probably going to be there actually should be some disrobing involved with this, because you need to see the patient's skin. You're looking for bruises. If the patient has a problem with that, or if they have a problem with you being of the opposite gender, we simply say, yes, by all means, we'll get somebody of the same gender for you, whatever it is takes to make them comfortable. Once you've checked the rib cage, then you're going to start checking the abdominal cavity. You've got the upper and lower quadrants on the left and right. And you want to make sure that there's a certain amount of give in the abdomen, so that if it's really hard and rigid, there's probably internal bleeding. So you're looking for that. Then you can reach around behind the person's back, and you're feeling along, looking for, like, is there a piece of glass stuck in their back, or there are things poking out, or ribs actually completely dislocated from the spine and they've got lumps in the back or whatever. You need to know all this kind of stuff. And again, pull your hands out, check to make sure that there's no blood or anything on them, make sure they're not bleeding back there. Move their weight, down to their hips. You're checking for fracture of the pelvis, so you can push out on the wings of the pelvis and then kind of pull in from the backside a little bit, pull them in. See, they shouldn't move really, and they'll sing out if they're broken. In the same manner as you've checked the arms and the hands, you're going to work your way down the legs, check the knee joints, the ankle joint, the toes, make sure that the feet can flex. Usually by the time you get down to the toes, you take your hands and let them put their feet, their toes against your palm there, and push. And then you can grab onto the toes and have them pull back. And you do both sides at the same time. Again, it's that bilaterally symmetrical ability that most people have. The last thing, in the way I do it, is you would stand next to the patient and roll them up on their side next to you or against you, so that you act as a stop to keep them from flopping over. And then that way you can lean over and see their back and check along their spine Again, looking for injuries and bleeding and that sort of thing. Documenting everything. So there's all sorts of that's a very short summary of what a head to toe assessment is, but it is essentially what you're doing, and it's why it's so important to have somebody with you. And you need to use all of your senses, where you're listening for things, you're obviously looking, but you've got your sense of touch, where you can tell temperature, if something feels abnormally cold or warmer, you know, and your sense of smell. You know, if things don't smell right, you try and figure out what's going on, because you never know how bad somebody's going to be injured until you've really given them a good exam. And then at that point, if there are some lesser injuries that need to be taken care of, as opposed to the ones that might kill somebody within minutes, well, you can also then take that time to, you know, to clean up a wound and bandage it properly, and you've got a little more time at this point. You know, it's not quite so panic a situation where you can treat that patient and give them more care and hopefully make them feel a little bit better. So.
Terry, the thing
Yes.
I think you were looking for is pupils are equal
Oh.
and
Thank you.
reactive.
Thank you. I didn't say that.
Is that it?
When you're examining their face, you definitely, it's a good idea if you can to have some sort of a flashlight, but ideally a pen light is nice. But you know, you can just that beam down a little bit. So you can take this and flash that light over their eyes, and then go check the other one and see if the pupils, as Lola said, are, it's called PEARL, P-E-R-L, which is pupils equal and reactive to light. Because again, they should do that. Now, your eyes will not dilate together unless the light source is hitting both eyes, then they will. But if you cover one eye or close one eye and only expose one to the light, only that one is going to go pinpoint. The other one will stay open. So all you're concerned with is if I flash the left eye with the light and I watch what it did, and then I move over and do it to the right eye, and it does the same thing, you're fine. If one of them doesn't, again, now they're not reacting the same, or if they don't react at all, you know, that could be indicative of some definite head injuries. And again, you're making a note of all of this, and that detailed patient chart that you're creating, that stays with the patient. When you pass them off to some other higher level of medical care, you send that with them. We don't need to keep that in the CERT area. We don't need to turn it into the city because they're not going to be concerned with it. What their concern is, you had this patient and you assessed their condition and you moved them on to where they needed to go. And so they're going to say, how many did you see? And you say, well, we had 30, and you know, gosh, 10 of them were critical, and this is what we did. You know, we moved them to somewhere. And then you had, you know, 17 were walking wounded, and then the balance where you're delayed. All they're concerned with is how many, what was their classification, and did you send them off somewhere? That's all the city's going to be concerned with. So we have a treatment center record that you keep that tells that. We had 16 people that were red and 42 people that were yellow and 150 that were green. And we sent the reds to Salem Hospital, and we sent the yellows, you know, 30 of them went to whatever, wherever you sent them. And then you turn that in. But we don't need to have the patient's names in the treatment center. That information, if you can get that and you put it on their treatment record that stays with them, that's darn handy, because that way they can make sure that the document that they have with the patient goes with that person instead of somebody else's. You know, but there are different ways of doing this. Generally speaking, you're working your way down from head to toe. When you do the arms, depending upon what document you read on telling you how to do this, they can change a little bit. The important thing is that once you start doing this, you do it in the same way on every patient so that you develop a bit of a habit, and that way you don't forget to do something. You know, you don't forget to come back and check the arms and you miss something like that. You're checking for, you know, they're in here, they're saying pulse. You know, I don't know that you really need, you can, if you are adept at taking somebody's pulse, that's information that you can put on there. But definitely you want to check their perfusion at the extremities, toes and fingertips, that sort of thing, because that can tell you something about the circulation situation. The injuries that you can't see, when in doubt, assume that they have them. If you suspect that there could be a spinal injury or a head injury or a neck injury, you're going to immobilize them, but only if you have some reason to believe that's the case. Because once you've immobilized somebody like that, it makes their life a lot harder. And if there's no reason for it, you know, you just cause them some issues. So, when in doubt, you think there might be some sort of spinal or neck injury, immobilize them. It says one of the things is do no harm, you know, minimize movement of the head and the spine while treating any life-threatening condition, because you don't really know quite for sure what's going on. The only caveat to that is if for some reason you are concerned that that building is about to collapse, you probably shouldn't be in there. But if you are, you're going to try and move that patient out, because you have to, you know, the motto that we use is the greatest good for the greatest number. But if you're treating a particular patient, sometimes you have to ask the question, what is the greatest good for this patient right now? And that might mean I need to move them out of this building so that, you know, and I've had people in class say, what, you might paralyze them. And it's like, you might, but if you leave them and the building collapses on them and they die, you know, that seems to me to be a little bit worse situation than if they're paralyzed. We didn't give them the injury that paralyzed them, but you know, again, you're trying to save their lives. We're trying to do the best that we can. So this other section here, I'm going to come back to this because it's just a couple minutes after 7. I'm going to give you guys a break, because otherwise I tend to just keep talking and go on until the end of class. And I have people squirming in their seats and all that kind of stuff. So, I'll come back at 7:10, and by all means, if you got any questions you think of, ask me. So I'll see you in just under 10 minutes.
Can whoever's typing or washing their dishes or something mute their mic, please?
Okay, looks like we're about at 10 minutes after 7, or pretty darn close to it. So one of the things that they have this nice list here on the page about things that you're looking for. You always want to pay attention to that. Change in consciousness. Are they in and out of consciousness, or were they conscious and then they passed out? Any sort of paralysis, pain or pressure, tingling or numbness, breathing or seeing, bleeding, bruising, deformity of the head or spine. I talked about the blood or fluid in the ears or the nose, bruising behind the ear, that's the battle syndrome. The raccoon eyes, bruising around the eyes. If you see that and they're not, if they don't have any sort of impact injury, that again can be issues indicative of some sort of head trauma. The pupils not being equal and reactive, seizures and nausea, that sort of thing. So you're looking for all of that. Obviously, any of these things are going to put your patient clear into the critical area, and you want to get them to better medical care as quickly as you possibly can. Stabilizing the head, they talk about if you obviously had the foam collar that they use to stabilize the head, that's darn handy, but we probably don't have that. So what you're going to do is using what you can. That can be towels or blankets. The patient's shoes can be used, and strips of bed sheet to tie everything down to hold them, just to keep their head from moving around. It's nice to know what the professionals use, because then it gives you an idea of what it is you're going to have to try and improvise, utilizing whatever materials you can find around you. Really, that whole concept of improvise, adapt, and overcome really comes into play, especially dealing with the medical. So it even talks about looking for materials, a door, a desktop, some sort of building materials to make a backboard out of, towels, draperies, or clothing for padding and stabilization, that sort of thing, and also to keep them warm, blankets, that sort of stuff. Now, you only move the survivors to increase their safety of them and you as a rescuer. Otherwise, if there isn't really any reason, then you don't need to move them. Unless you're just spread so thin that you can't keep coming back, you're having to travel too large of an area. But ideally, you're going to have a lot of people willing to help. They're going to ask you if they can help, and so you're going to try and utilize the resources, which can be people as well. So obviously, you really got to stabilize them if you're concerned about a neck or spinal injury. That's where your backboard situation comes in. They talk about in the light search and rescue, they're going to cover the transportation portion of it. So then we have their exercise, which actually gets us probably at the end of the treatment section. Public health considerations. This is also going to be a big and important part, not just as a CERT team, but just as a survivor of a major earthquake like that. As I mentioned earlier, dysentery and cholera are two big things that always pop up to this day. They have somebody, you know, like in Puerto Rico, they had that huge earthquake a couple of years ago, a few years ago, whatever it was. Huge problem because all of your normal things that you rely on, especially for us here in the US, where you have running water and functioning sewer systems, and all those things suddenly break down. And now what do? You want to make sure that you don't get any kind of cross-contamination going on. So they talk about hygiene and sanitation. Hygiene, of course, is keeping yourself clean. Washing hands frequently using soap and water. Well, these days, that's probably a bit more common of a thing than it used to be. I'm not saying people didn't wash their hands, but a lot of people are washing their hands multiple times a day now. Excellent hygiene, to the extent that a lot of people are having dry skin issues because of the soap. They're talking about hand sanitizers, which don't require water, which do work, and I do recommend maybe you have some of that. But in a disaster, well, not in a disaster, in a pandemic, it can be extremely hard to find that stuff. So you know, whatever kind of soap and water you can find may be what you have to use. And another reason for why you want to have some of those gloves. Now, the nitrile gloves you can buy in a number of places. Harbor Freight happens to be an excellent place, assuming they have them right now, because everybody and their uncle is trying to go buy rubber gloves. Hopefully that has slacked off a bit. I haven't looked lately. I had quite a few at my house, so I never bothered to go out and look. But they do mention about using non-latex gloves, simply because these days, seemingly a lot of people have a severe allergic reaction to latex, whether that be the person wearing them or somebody that they touch. So that's the reason it says not to use latex gloves, because you don't know if this person who's a stranger to you, if they're going to be allergic to it or not. Keep dressing sterile. Well, you do the best you can, but in a certain disaster scenario that we're talking about, the earthquake, you're going to use the cleanest that you possibly can find, but it may not be sterile. May not be anything we can do about that. It's better to keep them from bleeding to death than it is to worry necessarily about somebody getting an infection that they might get, but that's going to be a slower process, and hopefully we'll get them to better care where they can take care of that. Wash areas using soap and water or diluted bleach that come in contact with bodily fluids. That's you keeping yourself. The phrase that goes along with that is, if it's warm and wet and it's not yours, you don't want to touch it. So maintaining sanitation is, what are you going to do with biohazardous materials, whether that be bloody cloths, any of that sort of thing that's contaminated by somebody's body fluids. And also, what are you going to do about human waste? So you may have to go back to what the military does under certain circumstances, and you start digging a slit trench or something like that, and you're going to cover it up with dirt. If you have to do that, then you want to find something to use as a stake. And if you have some red triage tape, something along that line, and you take 2 stakes, stick them in the ground, stretch a piece of red triage tape between it. Even if you don't have the ability to write on it, generally speaking, the professional authorities are going to know what that means. And certainly if you have a Sharpie, some sort of magic marker or something like that, write on their human waste or something to that. And you're going to bury it because you don't want animals digging it up and then running around and spreading it all over the place. So that's pretty important. Water purification. There are quite a number of quality water filters that are out there on the market. So if you're interested in that, I would recommend looking into it. And if you can find one that's in your price range and you want to buy that, by all means, for your own personal use. They do talk about ways here to purify water. So the first step in purifying water is knowing the source of the water, and are you going to be successful in purifying it? So if you can catch rainwater, I'd say you have a big tarp, big one. Those blue ones work really well for this. And you can set some stakes up and put that big tarp up and make a giant funnel out of it with a hole in the middle and something to collect the water underneath there. And you're collecting rainwater from around here. That's a fairly good source of water, but don't catch it off the roof, because your roof, typically most roofs anymore, have moss growing inhibitors treated onto the materials. And also, if it's an asphalt roof, the 3-tab shingles and all that kind of stuff, that's going to contaminate the rainwater. And so now you're going to have problems dealing with that. Obviously, running down to the Willamette River and getting a bucket full of water is probably not a very good idea either, because even today, the Willamette's not very clean. If you got a well, if you happen to live in an area where you have a well, it might be dirty from the earthquake shaking everything up, and there may be some sediment that has gotten in there or stirred up on the bottom, but that water is probably pretty good too. So the first thing to do is to strain it through like a coffee filter or a t-shirt or something along the lines, where you're just trying to get the majority of the particulate matter out of it. And then you can run that water through your water filtration system that you have. And all of that, just literally dirt that's in there is, and pine needles and what have you, is not going to clog up your filter that's going to do that's actually purifying the water. So if you've got something like that, that's great. They do talk about boiling it, and that means it has to be a rolling boil for a minute, not from the time you put it on the fire, 1 minute later, you take it off. No, you have to bring it to a boil and then wait your minute in order for it to kill any of the Giardia or whatever that might be in there, bacteria and that sort of thing. So that's boiling. And then you have the concept of using 8 drops of bleach or 16 drops of bleach if the water is cloudy or dirty. Okay, so that's the textbook answer right there, and it's telling you that. So I'm going to talk about those things. Boiling water works pretty good. The downside is that it requires a source of fuel to heat the water. You got to have a pan that is capable of handling the heat, which you can probably find. Somebody's kitchen's probably got a pan. And then you have to have a certain amount of time after you've boiled it to let it cool down to a temperature that you can use, unless you're making coffee or tea or something. You know, you're probably going to have to, if you're using it to wash your hands, obviously boiling water is not very good for that. So you can only boil so much at a time. The bigger the pot of water, the longer it takes and the more fuel it's going to require. So it's fuel intensive and it's time consuming. It works, but it's got issues with that. If you're clarifying water with bleach, there's a couple of things about that. The most important one is that if it's the water temperature. The water really needs to be about 60 degrees or warmer, because once it gets down to 55 degrees and colder, your bacteria and such more or less hibernates and it stops metabolizing. And so you can put the bleach in the water, but the bacteria is asleep and it's not metabolizing. And so you're not killing the bacteria. And then you drink the water. Now the water gets into your stomach and your stomach's at a happy 98 degrees and it warms everything up, and that bacteria simply wakes up and it's all happy and ready to go, doing all of its bad things to your system. The other problem is it says 8 drops of bleach per gallon, and you have to wait 30 minutes to allow it to do its job. But it says if it's cloudy, well, you put in 16 drops, okay? The problem is that it leads to the possibility of over treating the water with bleach. And if you think Salem's water tastes like chlorine, try this sometime. And on top of that, if you get, you look at it and go, I think that was 8 drops. And then you look at it and go, well, it's pretty cloudy. So you put some more in and maybe that's 16, but maybe it was 30. You didn't really count very well. The problem is with that, and also with your iodine, the potential is there for you to slowly poison yourself with too much chlorine or too much iodine. The other thing is, even if you stick to the protocol and you're processing your water and you're only using 8 drops per gallon and it's warm enough to do the job and all of that, you still have an issue with, over a period of time, you're putting that much chlorine in to kill bacteria. Well, you've also got bacteria in your digestive system, and the bleach is pretty indiscriminate. And so if over a period of time, you can give yourself some digestive issues because you're starting to kill off some of the good bacteria that you need that's in your digestive system. Somebody's popped up a question. Apple cider vinegar is a natural disinfectant. Your toilet holding tank, if you have not put cleaners in it, it's also a good source of water in an emergency. True enough. And a really great source to remember is your hot water heater, because they typically are holding 40 to 50 gallons of clean water. And so you can tap the water out of that by closing the inlet valve so that you're not getting any more water from the street. You probably wouldn't anyway, but just to make sure. And then you can open the vent, the pressure valve. If it gets too hot, it bleeds off the pressure. Well, there's a little lever on top usually, and you can kick that thing open. So that way air can get into it and you can drain it. There's a valve on the bottom, you can drain it out, hook it to a garden hose. The first batch of water that comes out the bottom will probably have a certain amount of rust and sediment in it. So you might want to catch that in a separate container, and you can filter that through a t-shirt, coffee filter, whatever you have. And even if you decide you don't want to drink that rusty looking water, by all means, you can use that water to wash your hands and wash other things with. Because it's pretty darn clean water, even if it's got rust in it. I don't personally recommend the bleach solution or the iodine tablet solution to purify water, unless you have no other choice really. But keep in mind that there's 2 things that this process won't take out, and most even of your commercially available water purification systems, filters and such, they'll take out the bacteria, but they won't take out toxic chemicals, and they won't take out heavy metals. Lead that's dissolved in some form or a number of other things, mercury and that kind of stuff. So it's very, very important to know the source of the water. You don't go out and pick it up out of the gutter. You don't get it off your roof. You don't take it out of the river. I mean, the river's bad enough now. Wait until the earthquake happens and all kinds of things have spilled. And that includes the streams too. You have to be out in an area that's rural. Maybe you can find a spring, a natural spring that's coming out of the ground outside of there. That's fine, because you're getting the water right out of the ground. But generally speaking, you really need to know your source. So that's why it is very important as part of your home kit to store water, whether it be in the small, half-liter bottles, or get it in the 1-gallon jugs or the 2.5-gallon jugs. That water was sterile when it went into the jug, and it has an expiration date on it, but trust me, it'll go a lot longer than the expiration date that's on the jug. When we had our water scare here, when they had that toxic bloom up there and we couldn't use the water, I started tapping my water supply, and I realized I had stuff that had expired a few years before, and I used it and it worked just fine. So store water, because you're looking for a gallon of water per person per day. And also if you have pets, you need to take them into account as well. And if you're doing heavy work or the weather is very hot, you might need even more than a gallon of water per person per day. And that's just what they want you to consume. You also need a source of water, a quantity of water to wash your hands for hygiene and and a certain amount for sanitation and that sort of stuff. So water is probably the weakest link. So if you can store enough water to hopefully keep you going for that 2 to 3 week period of time before the national response that's going to happen is going to show up, and really being able to start getting water out to people, you're going to be so much better off. And then they do have, after water purification, they have this thing. It says rescuers should not put anything on wounds other than purified water. The use of other solutions like hydrogen peroxide is up to the medical professionals, not to us. We're not doctors, we're not nurses. The big reason is on the hydrogen peroxide, the reason they mention that is hydrogen peroxide actually kills tissue. Now, if you've got a little cut on your finger and you put some on and it fizzes and kills everything right there, it's no big deal. You wipe it off, you put a Band-Aid on it, away you go. But if you've got a bad wound and you pour a bunch of hydrogen peroxide in there, it's going to kill all the things that you want to kill, that are the bacteria and virus, whatever that might be down in there, but it's also going to start killing the tissue. And then you're going to bandage it up, and now you've got dead tissue down inside of a wound that you've bandaged, and it's going to turn into gangrene. So there's a solid reason why you say we don't do these things as CERT team members. And it's important to remember, as we said before, stay within the scope of practice. Scope of practice says don't use hydrogen peroxide or rubbing alcohol or anything else on a wound. You can only use clear water. Stay with that. And then you're protected by the Volunteer Protection Act and the Good Samaritan Law and the city's insurance as well. So those are important things to remember. And then we have the summary, which I will let you read on that. And then we get into disaster psychology. And I've probably got just about enough time to cover disaster psychology. By all means, read this. And there's actually, in the past, there have been classes that were taught just on this topic, and it was about an 8-hour class, I believe. It happens periodically. By no means is it a regularly scheduled thing, but if you have an opportunity to either see a program on it or take a class on it, by all means do so. The psychological impact of a disaster of this nature is going to be widespread, and it affects not just the victims of an earthquake, but also the rescuers. That would be us. It can affect us as well. So I'll kind of go through the high points on this, and that'll probably get us just about to 8 o'clock. So
Terry, they all got the links with the last class message for how to deal with people with different conditions, which might be worth viewing as they think about the disaster psychology.
okay. Before I move on, as somebody had put down, is natural saline okay? I assume you're talking about sterile saline solution that the medical professionals use. If you've got some, by all means, that's clear. That's sterile, and that's fine. You can flush it with, if you've got it. Most of us don't, but if you do, by all means, that is good, something to use. It's just something that in the average household, most people don't have. So let's move on here to the overview. Well, I'll let you read that. So disaster reactions, dealing with your own personal loss, working with people in your neighborhood, neighbors, friends, coworkers, family members who've been injured. The feeling of unsafe and insecure. When you're dealing with an earthquake, that's a real common one because there are aftershocks, and that makes people really nervous that it's going to happen again. So they have a lot of terminology in here. I'm hardly an expert on disaster psychology, although I have heard it. There is a lady out there, her name is Amanda Ripley. She's written some good books on this topic. So this is her field of study. You can probably look her up on the internet, Amanda Ripley. One of the things, a takeaway that I saw in relation to what she was doing was she's not particularly fond of disaster psychology as a terminology. She prefers survivor psychology. It just puts a bit more positive spin on it. Perhaps it's slightly more accurate, I suppose. I mean, both of them really are. I mean, this is a psychology because of a disaster, but it's also, you're dealing with people who are survivors. Vicarious trauma, they're describing that as an occupational hazard for disaster response volunteers and the professionals as well. We actually saw that through in 9/11, even, and also at the Oklahoma City bombing. The dogs, the search dogs, the ones who are supposed to be looking for survivors, were being traumatized by the fact that they were only finding people who had died, to the extent that the professional responders were actually going and hiding just so the dogs could find them and find somebody who was alive. They were actually treating the psychology of their search dogs. So it's a real thing. And there's also, the compassion fatigue, all sorts of stuff. Basically, post-traumatic stress disorder, I would imagine. So you have your what they call the flight, or the fight or flight, but it's actually, there's the first one is people tend to freeze at first, and then they might run away, they might try to fight it, they're probably likely going to be afraid of it, and some people will faint. It just depends. So those are 5 different ways that you can respond to massive amounts of stress. The symptoms, emotional, and there's also cognitive. So the emotional symptoms can be a wide variety, and you might have any combination of them, or you'll see people who do. Nervousness, helplessness, shock, and it goes on and on. Then there's cognitive, which tends to inhibit your ability to make logical decisions. They talk about memories and flashbacks. If you've ever lived through any sort of traumatic event in your life, you have that memory is fused into your brain in a way that's different than your day-to-day memories, and they can come back. And I'll tell you, it's like having a movie play for you, and you remember every single detail. It's just like watching that movie over and over again. So that's definitely a real thing. They talk about disassociation, distortion of time and space. I mean, it's just a ton of things. By all means, read this. But spiritual stuff, loss of hope, intense use of prayer, loss of self-efficacy, feelings of despair and disillusionment. Why me? Why did this happen to me? That kind of thing. But there's also physical symptoms. Your appetite, you can have headaches, all sorts of things that can affect you. Definitely can affect your sleep. Can give you nightmares, or you just can't go to sleep, insomnia, or you wake up after a short period of time. Definitely having fatigue or low energy. Also symptoms of depression, which would go along with this. So they talk about self-care and team well-being. This relates to the CERT team members. They used to have a debrief, and it was a required thing. And the professionals did that, and they tried to work that into the CERT program. They're saying after you come off of your shift, you have to do a debrief. You have to talk about what you saw. You have to talk about what you feel. And what they found was that by forcing people to deal with it out of their own way, it actually did more harm than good. And that's why you will see down here now, it says, do not force you to talk if you are not ready. That's a relatively recent change in how to deal with this sort of stuff. So they talk about the preventative steps, explaining to your loved ones and friends how to support you when you return from a disaster area. Probably giving them a heads up is not a bad idea. I can tell you that for all, all of this stuff in here is good, and by all means read it. And if you read a book on disaster psychology, just kind of keep track of how long it took you to read it and turn that in. I'm sure they'll probably give you some kind of research hours for that, because it's definitely related. But personally speaking, there's the wisest thing that I was ever told was that when you are going through something that's really traumatic like this, there's no right way to go through it. There's only your way to go through it. Unfortunately, what I learned was, not unfortunate that I learned it, but what I learned was that we don't come with an instruction manual. And so consequently, unless you've been through some traumatic experience, whether that be, regardless of what it is, loss of a loved one, or house burns down, or whatever that might be, you don't know what your way is, and you have to experience it and learn as you go along. There are definitely wrong ways to go through this. Relying on alcohol or drugs or any of that kind of stuff, or other sorts of self-destructive behavior, those are wrong ways to go through it. They might make things seem a little bit better for a short period of time, but they're not going to, in the long run, they're not going to make anything better. So there are definitely wrong ways, but there's no right way. Nobody can tell you exactly how you have to go through this. They can give you tidbits of advice based on what their personal experiences are, but they can't tell you how you're going to have to deal with this. You're going to have to learn on your own. If you've been through it once, something like that, as I said, some sort of traumatic experience, loss of a loved one, or a house fire, or something else, that gives you an edge. Because you've been through something. It may not be exactly the same as what you're going to go through the next time, but you've learned some of the techniques, and you've learned more about yourself and how you deal with it. And perhaps you found some things that you realized, hey, maybe that wasn't such a good thing to do at the time. And so you've learned from that. So the kind of the takeaway is that the more, if you've been through something traumatic, that's going to help you during an earthquake. But also being prepared, having a kit, having ways to emulate the normalcy of life, and also having training, any of those things. So being prepared in terms of, I've got water, I've got food, I've got the meds. I can improvise a toilet if that's a 5-gallon bucket with a toilet seat attached to it. And I've got a shower curtain I can wrap around it, and gosh, I have an improvised bathroom. It's a little bit like normal. That helps, that kind of stuff. But also training. The CERT class is by all means a good way. But there's other sorts of training. If you're experienced with camping, and you a lot of things you can do. You can take first aid courses that are far more in depth than anything we can do in this class. All of those things are going to give you a bit more confidence and some skills that you're going to be able to use, and that's going to make it better on you. And consequently, then you can do a better job of helping people who don't have those skills or who haven't experienced traumatic things in their life. So that's a good, all of those things add up to making it better for you. And that's what we're trying to do, is set you up to be a survivor out of this earthquake. The earthquake itself is not going to be that hard of a experience to survive, assuming you're not in an unreinforced masonry building where you are at risk, or in a big box store or something like that when it happens. But you're outside, or you're in a site-built home, those things survive pretty well. So it's trying to survive the aftermath of what is it like living in basically going from what we enjoy on a day-to-day basis as a civilized society to suddenly going to the equivalent of being dropped in the middle of the woods someplace with nothing. And for a lot of people, that's the way it's going to be. That How am I going to get enough food? How am I going to get enough water? That sort of thing. You know, what am I going to do? So if you are prepared, that goes a long way to bridge that gap until the authorities can come in with all of this stuff that we need to try and restore some sort of normalcy to our life. The self-care toolbox, that's kind of an activity. So you can kind of look this over. Greatest challenges, that's kind of almost like a personal checklist, I think. And you can by all means look at this. This is in the manual, and you can do this for yourself. Talking about, you know, what's the situation and what can you do about it? Nutrition, sleep, managing a workload, that kind of stuff. So they talk about how team leaders reduce the stress. You've got to make sure that your team doesn't work too long, and you will find people out there who tend to do that. They tend to say, well, there's more work to be done. I just got to stay at it. And they get themselves more and more exhausted, and consequently, they become more and more vulnerable. And I think one that is a fairly important one in here is you take volunteers who've been doing a high stress operation and don't just cut them loose. Switch them over to a low stress, maybe something at your team leader's location where they can be transcribing notes or whatever, some sort of a task that kind of lets them kind of bleed off the stress before you cut them loose for the day and their shift ends. Might help them a little bit. If they're ready to talk with them, or listen is the big thing. Survivors' emotional responses, they have these different phases that you talk about. The pre-disaster phase, you may have some warning in case of a hurricane or a tornado, that kind of stuff. Excuse me, the impact phase, you got the heroic phase when right afterwards people are going to be doing a lot of stuff. They're out there weeks and months following the disaster. There may be some assistance available. But the disillusionment phase and the reconstruction phase is going to take a long time. The disillusionment phase is, well, why isn't it done now? And it took a long time to build our society. It's going to take a long time to rebuild it after this. So you've got, they talk in here about the cognitive function, physical health, interpersonal relationships can frequently suffer from this kind of stuff. Obviously, in some cases, probably getting some counseling is probably a good idea, but it's going to take a while to be able to find people available. There is a section in here that what I'm looking for right now, what I think is like the most important one. They talk about listening. That's a really good one. There are times when you realize your job is just to sit there and listen. You don't need to come up with an answer. You don't really need to respond. You just need to be there. They know that you're there and they just need somebody to listen to them. That's a really big thing. And sometimes it's a little hard to not say something, but sometimes that's the right answer. What I'm looking for is there we go. There it is right there. This to me is one of the most important things in this entire chapter. What not to say. Make this a part of you because trust me, you don't want to say these things. They're natural things to say. You're coming from a position of compassion and you want to help them. And so we say these things that are not the right thing to say, but you're trying to do the right thing. So it's important to understand what is not right. And that one is the first one. I understand. In most situations, you don't understand how they feel. You can't be inside their head and you can't know what they're going through. Telling them to not feel bad. It's 100% true. They have a right to feel bad. They're going to feel bad, regardless of whether you tell them it's okay or not to feel bad. telling them that you're strong or you're going to get through this. You don't know them, and they don't feel strong. You can encourage them to try and be strong, but telling them that they are strong, you don't know. Telling them don't cry. Well, this is probably, you're dealing with somebody who's going through what to them is probably the worst thing they've ever been through in their entire life. Ain't nothing wrong with crying. Let them do it. Let them get it out. Talking about whether or not it's God's will. Well, you don't know their belief structure, whether they do or not. So it's one thing if it's somebody that's close to you and you do know their belief structure, that's one thing. But that's not really a CERT scenario, because in CERT you're dealing with strangers and you don't know. So just stay away from religion and stay away from politics, because you don't know who these people are. And then saying it could be worse, and the likely response you're going to get is, really? So they probably can't imagine at that particular moment how anything could possibly be worse, and so that's not going to make anything better. So you don't want to say any of those things. They tend to generate some sort of on the small end, it's irritation, and they could get extremely angry at the other end. So, and if you say something that seems to be wrong, apologize for it. They talk about some other things about what you can say instead. I'm not a professional. I think the ones that I look at here that I think are probably really good is asking them if there's anything that you can help them with, and ask them if there's anything that they need. To me, those are the two best things that you could possibly say to somebody at that point. The rest of the stuff, I can't imagine what this is like for you. That's probably true. You can't. And saying, I'm sorry this happened to you, I'm sorry for your pain, those can definitely come across as platitudes, and somebody may not really be interesting. They may not be interested in hearing it. I don't know. It's just, but asking if it's all right to help and asking if they need anything, those they may tell you no, but they're not going to be offended because you asked to help. I mean, it's completely obvious what your motivation there is. You're simply wanting to help them, and that's fine. If you have to, they also throw in with the disaster psychology that they got the managing the death scene, which is also the morgue. And if you've got people who want to come and view the body, you have to allow them to do that. But you've got local laws and protocols for handling the body, and realistically, we're not trained with that, but you do the best you can. Keep anybody who's working in the morgue area there for as short a period of time as you possibly can, an hour, maybe 2 at the outset, and then trade them out and get somebody else in there, because it's not a very pleasant thing to have to do. So they have a summary, and they talk about in various things that in the previous versions of the book, they talk about the various things where you have the denial and anger and all these different emotions that can come up. And again, this area of expertise for people, they are changing. They're reevaluating what they used to teach. And so that's why there's some things that you may not see in here that you may have heard. One of them is there's this whole list of the different stages that you go through. I say denial is one, and you end up with acceptance and all sorts of that sort of thing. And you may go through them more than once. You may not. You may skip some of them. Who knows? Like I said, I can only speak from my personal experience, and that is that you're not going to find out how you deal with this sort of stuff until you are faced with it and you have to go through it. There are certain things you can do. Trying to stick to your normal routine and taking care of those tasks that you normally would need to do. Trying to, like I said, your your hygiene, making sure that you eat at the times that you normally eat. You may not be interested in eating very much, but having something just because it's breakfast time and I should eat. And then it's lunchtime, I should eat. It's dinner time, I should eat. It's time to go to bed, I should go to sleep. Those tasks, those simple tasks, you want to try and make sure that you go through those steps. And at first, you're going through something that's pretty bad. You're going to be going through them like a zombie. You will not care if you're dealing with this sort of psychology in your own life. You do things because you know you should do them, and that's a good thing. And sometimes that's all the motivation that you can muster. So that's fine. Eventually, things change, and as they say, over time, things do get better if you get farther and farther away from the event. But yeah, you may not care about doing a lot of things, but you've got to make sure that you maintain yourself, try to do those things. And allowing people to help you is a good thing, because they may also be going through their own grief process, and that may be helping them with that. So there's a lot of information in here, a lot more than I covered. I do recommend that you read this section, and there's lots more information out there. So if you're interested in knowing more, any sort of information that you learn, a class you take, a book you read, any of that kind of stuff that either gives you an insight or a skill set, that's all going to help you in your recovery after this event takes place, and also a lot of other things and generally in life. So by all means, try to gain those skills, read those books, watch videos if they're out there, that's fine. Soak up as much of that information as you can, because that's going to help you in your ability to be a survivor and be a successful survivor after an event like this. And that is as important to us as the CERT instructors for you. You're taking this class. We want you to be prepared. We want you to have the things that you need on hand to give you that extra edge against, versus the other 92% of society who wait until whatever event happens, and then they could decide, I'm going to go down to the store and I'm going to buy whatever it is I need. Well, the reality is there's too many people who have that plan, and so the stores are going to be picked clean in no time. Whereas if you have the ability to sit at home and write it out for a while and say, well, other people are far more in need than I am because I already have taken care of my family, and we have what we need, and we can just stay here, help and help other people as you can as CERT team members, if that is what's called for. And then eventually, when the professional help starts showing up and they start trucking in water, or flying it in, more likely, and flying in food and all that sort of stuff, the better off you're going to be. So that's going to help your mental status quite a bit. So I do have a question here that's been tossed up. How long can you leave water in a large water holding tank safely? Okay. Typically, the textbook answer used to be that if you're buying water in a sealed container, that it was it was a year, it was 1 year. And then they said, if you're using, like, for example, tap water, to put it into a clean container, then the answer was 6 months, and you would want to dump that water on your garden or your lawn or whatever, and then refill it again. Well, I think we've kind of learned that you can go longer than that. I've seen bottled water last for 5 years, 6 years. I haven't seen it go bad. Okay. Whereas if you're using a container that's not sterile, whether it be a large holding tank or whether you're using like 2-liter pop bottles that you've cleaned out, that sort of thing, definitely don't recommend using old milk jugs, because there's enzymes in the milk and they get into the porous plastic, and it's almost impossible to get them out. And so your water that you store in a milk jug is going to smell like sour milk. You're not going to find it very, very palatable, I wouldn't think. But 6 months to a year, probably. if you're using tap water or water from a well or that sort of thing, because it's not sterilized. And then just dump it wherever it does the most good in your property, and then refill it again. Clean a container and refill it again is probably going to be the correct answer there. So anything else on this? Oh boy, fire safety is up next. We will tackle that on Thursday. It's always a fun one. Unfortunately, we don't get to do it for real, but this is what it looks like if you can see this picture. You know, it's really cool. We have a stainless steel tub we fill full of water and feed propane up through it and light it on fire. And we have people come out with a fire extinguisher and put it out. So I wish we could do it for real, but because of the COVID restrictions, we can't. That's what we're going to cover on Thursday. So unless anybody else has any questions for me, I'm going to wrap it up for tonight. So I don't see anything popping up on the chat. I don't see Lola waving at me. So, okay, I think we're good. Thank you for showing up and listening to me all night. And I hope you have a good evening. And we will see all of you on Thursday.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Very much.
Thank you. Have a great evening.